All right. All right. So, in the first half of the class tonight, we talked about writing materials and a general background to writing and its purpose and the message that's being portrayed. And so, we're going to keep moving through. We're going to talk about biblical languages. To give you a little background of me and my history with languages. So, the first language I dove off into was Latin. I took 3 years at my high school, West Monroe High School. When they tell you that if you don't practice a language, you will definitely lose it. So I took 3 years of Latin. I think I at least had all A's all 3 years. I vaguely remember one year making like 100 the entire year in Latin, and I could not tell you anything about Latin right now. I took a year of French at the University of Louisiana at Monroe. Once again, if you don't use it, I used it for a vacation. My wife and I went to Guadeloupe, which is a French-owned Caribbean island, and they speak French. They don't hardly speak English at all. And I took it when I was in the midst of taking French there, and that was when I used it, and I never used it since. I knew enough French to be able to order us some food when we went out to eat, to get directions to go places, uh, and to understand when we were flying back to the United States that they were making fun of us Americans as we were the only ones. So then I've taken 2 years of Hebrew at Amherst University, a year of Greek, and a year of Akkadian. That is not Louisiana Akkadian, but um, the language of Akkad, the Assyrians. Um, so again, if you don't practice these languages, if you don't stay with them, they don't stay with you. So language is very important. I think if you really want to get into biblical studies, you've got to learn the languages. I'm taking a refresher right now in Hebrew just because I took a few semesters where I wasn't taking any textual classes and I wasn't using Hebrew very much. I was using the time I was actually, I forgot to include that I actually have one semester of Aramaic as well. But I was actually using that time to take the Greek and Aramaic that I'd never taken before and kind of stepped away from Hebrew for a little while. So I'm just taking a little refresher course to get back to the to understanding the technical aspects of Hebrew and refresh my mind there. So that's my background with languages. I don't see myself becoming a Dr. Cloud with 17. I think that that's enough. The university that I go to, if anybody's interested in biblical studies degrees, Amherst University is heavy on languages and archaeology. Most of the professors there, at least when I started, there some of them have moved on. Graduated from Hebrew Union, which is heavy in languages. My Greek teacher and Aramaic teacher actually works adjunct at Hebrew Union teaching Sumerian. He's one of the only teachers of Sumerian in the world. So if you're interested in languages, it's a very affordable but very high quality education there in languages. So let's move forward with our study here. So one thing that we have to address up front, and this kind of falls in line with understanding that the Bible wasn't written until writing became available. But we have to understand that Hebrew was not the first language. And some people get very appalled by that concept. Oh, Hebrew is the perfect language. It's the perfect God-given language to the people of Israel. Um, the problem with that is the Bible doesn't make that claim, and God doesn't make that claim. God did give His word in Hebrew. I think that's very important to understand. Um, but we have to understand that Hebrew is not the first language. Hebrew borrows a lot of stuff from Akkadian. It borrows stuff from Ugaritic uh, words and meanings. So and its transmission, its formation, we can really tie back to a certain point in history that coincidentally comes down to about the point in history where Moses is wandering through the desert and starts writing down the things that God tells him to write down for future generations. The other thing we have to understand is there's a difference between language and script. So they're usually called the same thing. I speak English. I'm speaking English right now, and I would write what I'm saying in the English script. The ancient world spoke Hebrew, and they would write down in the Hebrew script sometimes. Um, Other languages are not so. Other languages, you would have like Akkadian. Akkadian is the language, it's what the people spoke, written down in the cuneiform script. Babylonians used the same cuneiform script, even though some of their letters are a little different. And Ugarit, it uses cuneiform, but we'll talk about it in a very different way. So they're using the same script for different languages. And we get kind of certain circles of believers, or can get been around trying to figure out what was the perfect Hebrew or what was the perfect script. This script is older than that script. We have to understand that these things were written down to give us a message. What the letters look like are way less important than what the letters are trying to tell you. They could be written in a different script. They could be written in a different language. What's the message that's being delivered? We have to understand that with language. What is the message that's trying to be said? We say, we have some people that go to great lengths to try to understand how to vocalize, quote unquote, true Hebrew or true, that's the only, that's my, I have, that's the only that I've been exposed to is that concept of true Hebrew and how was it pronounced. It doesn't matter how it's pronounced. It changed over time, very much so. The way that Moses spoke Hebrew no doubt sounded very differently than the way Jesus would have spoken Hebrew. Did that matter? No, it's the message that's being portrayed. It's the story that's being told. Go back to the very first thing we talked about tonight. What is the story that's being told? What is the story that we're trying to pass down from generation to generation? Is the story that I tell in English about the gospel message of God from the creation of the world to the resurrection of Jesus, is that story the same if I tell it in English as if I told it in Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic or even Akkadian? My understanding may change if I understand the languages in which it was written. I may be able to better understand the story. But if I tell it in that understanding in any language, does it matter? No. So the language and the script have to be understood to be two different things. The script changes over time. The way it's vocalized changes over time. We have the same thing in our own language. The way that you and I speak English today, and I think Kathleen's in the class, she would say definitely the way she and I speak English, because she can't understand me half the time in my Southern accent that I don't realize I have. The way that we speak English today is far, far unrecognizable to the way they spoke Old English or even Middle English. It's still English. The way that we write English today is far different than the way English was written in Old English or Middle English. But it's still English. When we read the writings of that world and people translate those or bring those forward into our modern English, then it's still telling the same story. And the only reference I have to that would be like Shakespeare. The plays of Shakespeare are still played out the same way. So we have to understand that when we think about the history of languages. So the first writings that we have, and we kind of talked about it, here's this stone carving again, where pictures are drawings. Those are the earliest writings. We have them in Sumerian, Egyptian, cuneiform, whether it was Akkadian or Babylonian, the Mesopotamian region. This is what they used. Where I have no idea where this stone drawing is from, by the way. It just looked cool, so I put it out there just to give you a representation. Everybody understands, they've seen what stone carvings are. These pictures were to tell a story through picture. In the very earliest times, these pictures were very simple. You would see, I can't even tell what this is going on. You've got an animal in the middle. You've got some women and children. It looks like, if I was to interpret this, and this will become important in a minute. if I was to interpret this picture, women and children are sitting around watching what looks to be like uh, half rabbit, half goat jump around and play. I have no idea. But they were very simple in nature at first, and then later on they became more intricate. They would be like a person, some water, and a fish, and they're trying to say, or maybe the fish is in the water. We understand this. Our children do the same thing today. My children, before they learn to write, they draw these pictures of what? A house and the family. And we understand that they're trying to tell a story. Here are these people that live in this house on a sunny day, and that kind of, we understand that. Same thing back then. They had these very simple pictures. Well, if I'm using these very simple pictures to tell a very simple story, what happens when I want to tell a more detailed story? I have to have a more detailed picture. I have to have a more complicated picture. So these pictures will become complicated over time. We have I don't know if it's the oldest, but it's very old, Sumerian tablets. Two tablets. One has a goat, one has a sheep, and they have numbers at the top. I think one had the number 10. I can't remember what the other had. They were clearly used to record herds of goats and sheep. This, again, back to what we talked about in the beginning, the earliest inscriptions past the storytelling drawings that we find on stone, the first inscriptions of really kind of writing is to record data. So here we have a Sumerian tablet that's showing a record of what someone's heard, what the size of it was at one given point in time. As the cultures grew and we start having cities and we start having towns, what comes with that but a larger economy? And what comes with that but a larger need to record these type of things? You have people that are now bartering and selling, and they can't keep up with what they've sold to who, for how much, how many of them, just from their mind. Someone that owns a convenience store cannot remember how many Snickers bars he sold in a week and to who and for how much. So you have these these reasons developing in history that necessitate the use of recording different things like this. When we get to Egypt, we have Egypt recording history, and they use pictures, and we'll talk about it. Our understanding, or at least my understanding, I think probably most people's understanding of Egyptian is not what it was at one point in time. Now, extremely ancient Egyptian writings that we have, they portray history through picture. That's not writing in a language, but history through picture. They're recording things that happen, and we've seen some of these things in different societies. Egypt, we have the famous the walls from Lachish, or the Battle of Lachish from Sargon, where he depicts this battle of him defeating Israel on these huge tablets. They're in the British Museum. You can go into the room and view these huge depictions of this battle. That's telling a story of history, but it's not writing the story of history. So early Egyptians, they recorded history through pictures, and just like we would paint. What's one of the famous, the Battle of Waterloo? That's a famous painting. We do the same thing today. What are some limits to this? The first thing is emotions. So it's kind of hard outside of writing facial expressions, but if you look at the way cave paintings and stuff like that were, even then, even trying to depict facial expressions in their drawings would have been a challenge. So it's hard to show emotion. That's why the earliest writings you have are really these non-emotional or non, nothing deep being written. You have records being established. You can't show emotion through these writings very much. There's an issue with interpretations. So the person who draws it understands why he drew it. But now we go and we find these same drawings and we're left scratching our head, just like me trying to look at this picture on this slide to say, what did the person who drew this intend to be said? That's a huge limitation when it comes to trying to understand a story that someone was trying to tell us. They felt that the story was valuable enough to take their time to put it on this stone wall. Me personally, if someone with the limitations of resources that they had compared to us today felt it so important to place that story on that wall, I want to know what they intended to be understood. But we're limited by having no record of the original intent of interpretation of that story. I could see women and children sitting around laughing at a half-breed animal jumping around and frolicking in front of them. This could be a cultic inscription of a family getting ready to offer something to a deity. I have no idea. That's a huge limitation. And then they simply have forgotten meanings that kind of comes in with that, the interpretation. You just forget the meanings even within their own time. I'm comparing the interpretation to something thousands of years later, but even in their own time, they could have had forgotten meanings that wouldn't be lost very quickly in a generation or less. As we move forward from literal pictures being drawn to portray a story, we come to what we call a pictogram. Now, there's different names for different styles of writing. There's a great video that my friend Tyler posted the other day. I'll actually probably share that video and one other one in the group that have different labels for these things, but they all kind of mean the same thing. I'm going to share with how I was taught language and the names that's associated with it, but the names in the videos that I'll share, kind of, you'll see they go really hand in hand. So from that, we have pictograms. Now, a pictogram, we also call them, some people call them a pictograph. They're pictures that represent letters and sounds. Now, this is very important because people get this confused. They take a picture that is a scene to be used to tell a story. And then when similar pictures are used in language, they think that those pictures have meanings for either individual letters or something like that. Pictograms are pictures that represent letters or sounds. They're a simplification of those pictographic drawings. So the progression of language and writing throughout the history of mankind is always a proceeding, at least to a certain point. Today we have very complicated languages because they've all meshed together a good bit, but to a certain point, it was continuously looking for a simplification of how to write. It was a better way to communicate the message you're trying to tell. When we look at these pictograms, that's exactly what that was. They realized that they could take and make these pictures into stories. It's a scene, what we would call a scene. But then they could take those pictures and they could make them represent letters or sounds. So we look at the graph we have here. We look at the bird there. So this is a real evolution of a pictogram in Mesopotamia progressing to cuneiform. So you can see exactly how that goes from one thing to the next. So they start off with, we've made these paintings on walls. We've had these pictures. I know what a bird looks like. So I draw a bird and it represents a letter or a sound. For whatever reason, birds get turned. I mean, if I'm right-handed and I write like this, but then my buddy writes like this, who knows? So these letters get turned, but then they get to a place where they have a bright idea and they say, if I can make this picture even simpler, I don't have to give these artistic renditions of a bird, a fish, a foot, the sun, a piece of grain. I can simplify writing and I can write much faster. So then you have these wedge-shaped letters being formed. Well, you can see how much easier it is to simply stamp, because these are being written clay tablets mostly. So to stamp a flat, what was called a stylus, they would take a reed, they would smash the end of it so it's flat, just like we do with straws. You take a plastic straw and you bite on it, it becomes flat at the end. That's a stylus. And they would use that, and you could now stamp letters instead of taking a pointed object like a pen and trying to draw a picture of a fish or a duck. And so then you eventually come to the far right, which is cuneiform. So cuneiform was that style of writing in Akkadian. You have another category called logograms, which kind of is what some people believe like pictograph is. It's being less and less understood to be an actual thing. It was almost kind of like right there at the beginning, from going from those scene pictures to going to pictograms, you kind of have this mesh where you would have some letters, some pictures back and forth to mean things. Egyptian does that a lot. They would have a mixture of, at times in the history of Egypt, they would have a mixture of pictograms, logograms, and alphabetic letters, where you're writing a sentence and all of a sudden you actually give a picture of part of a scene of whatever you're talking about, and then you continue to write a sentence. That would generally be speaking about a logogram. It would have multiple meanings, but that's very small portion of history if it was really a thing at all. Then you have syllabic languages, and that's where Akkadian comes in. Now, I really love this language, really love the concept here, although I didn't love trying to study it. On the very far right, you have all these different symbols. Now, you can kind of compare this modernly to Oriental languages like Chinese and Japanese. They have symbols that are similar. Now, every one of these symbols is a syllabic letter. What I mean by that, we have in English, if I want to say Bible, it's 2 syllables, but it's 5 letters. And each letter contributes something to the sound of those 2 syllables. What a syllabary language does, each one of those symbols represents a full syllable. So by, the first part of Bible, so you have 2 syllables, by, bull. You would have a different letter for each one of those, Bible. And I usually simplify it with a B and use our vowels. So every utterance that you could make with the letter B would have a different symbol for that syllable. So you'd have a symbol for by, ba, or you starting with a ba, be, bi, bo, ba, and b. Any of those, all of those would have a separate letter. And what does that mean, or what does that look like? Well, you have the Akkadian language that has 613 symbols for their language. It's a very complicated language. But then you get down to alphabetic languages. This is where Hebrew comes in, Greek, and Ugaritic. So Ugaritic is very unique because it's a alphabetic language. What do I mean by that? So you're going from huge pictures that you have to draw to convey a message. Then you take portions of these pictures and make little letters. And then you go to you make it a syllabary language where all these letters mean a different syllable, like 600 symbols. Egyptian had over 1,000 symbols. Today, Chinese is the closest to it. Chinese has over 1,000 symbols, and they're used the same way. They're used as syllables. But to simplify things, you go from 613 symbols to an alphabet like Hebrew, where you have, like in English, we have A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So you have a B, and you can combine it with another letter to create the different syllables without having to memorize over 600 different syllables. Ugaritic was unique because it used the same cuneiform letters that Akkadian and Babylonian used, except for it was an alphabetic. It only had 20, well, it had 2 forms. At one point in history, Ugaritic had 30 symbols. And then guess what? They found a way to drop it from 30 down to 23, I think. But they used the same cuneiform that Akkadian used for 613 symbols, and they used it for an alphabet. So the whole concept is that as we're moving through history, we are making language much simpler and easier to convey. And the whole thing that I would like to drive home with all of this is the whole point is how can I more simply and more efficiently and more quickly tell the story that I'm trying to tell. And we understand that to be so important when we understand that that story we're trying to tell is the story of God's redemptive message, of Him redeeming mankind and drawing us close to Him. So um, when we go to the biblical languages, we have the Old Testament is, generally speaking, Hebrew and Aramaic. New Testament is Greek. We'll talk about each one of those a little bit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm running out of time, but for tonight, definitely can have some discussion. I'll probably put some language questions in there for discussion because I know people love talking about these different ones here. But here are some ancient inscriptions in both Hebrew and Greek. The top right is what very ancient Hebrew would look like. It doesn't even look recognizable that's a facsimile of an inscription. It doesn't even look recognizable to what we understand to be biblical Hebrew or modern Hebrew. And then the bottom is a very ancient inscription of Greek. So when we talk about the history of Hebrew, when you look at the top right there, you kind of see the same progression that we talked about with in the Mesopotamian languages in Egypt. You see what's a pictogram at the top. Now, this is referred to as two things, one of two things, and it depends on where you land as a scholar and how you understand the Bible. That's either Proto-Canaanite or Proto-Sinaitic. So it's Proto-Canaanite if you think that the Hebrews or Israel just borrowed the language from the Canaanites, or it's Proto-Sinaitic if you believe that Sinaitic referring to Mount Sinai, that this was the early inscriptions of the Hebrew. Now, what's interesting about this, we have very, very little inscriptions of this language known to us. Up until the 1920s, we virtually had no understanding or concept that this was even a possibility of the history of Egypt. We simply understood Hebrew to be a language that was formed from Phoenician, and we understood we understood Hebrew in that concept, but we had virtually no understanding of this Proto-Sinaitic inscription type language. In the 1920s to the 1940s, there's a lot of archaeology going on. There's a lot of digs happening, and we're finding a lot of inscriptions, and we come across this. And I have a very expensive but very small, like 40 or 50 pages book. I'm not at home, or I would have pulled it and shown it to you. But this book was written in the 1940s or 1950s, and it represented every Proto-Sinaitic inscription that we knew in the world at that time. It fit on like 40 pages. That includes all the description and the history and all that stuff. So we have very little understanding of or very little evidence of this Proto-Sinaitic alphabet. I'm not saying that wasn't what it was or it didn't exist. I do believe that definitely was the script being used at that time. Remember, difference between script and language. But when I understand that these people were speaking a language that they had to just find a way to write down, the script doesn't mean as much. What matters is the message they were telling. Just to give you a comparison, the bottom straight down underneath that, the very bottom, I think you can probably see it. I can use a cursor on this thing. So, wow, this class just got better. Technology, right? This right here is what we refer to as Paleo-Hebrew. Now, some people call this Paleo-Hebrew. This is not Paleo-Hebrew. This is Paleo-Hebrew. This is Hebrew. This is just progressed forward in time. This is like the time of the kings of Israel. These are the inscriptions. These are the Hebrew letters being used at that time. Very much different from here to here. This right here is Phoenician. Over here on the left is Phoenician. So you can probably understand why some people would make this connection. And I'm not so convinced that there's not at least some connection going on from here to here to here and all mixed up in between. Remember, these people are borrowing things. They're borrowing words and concepts and ideas from each other. Here is kind of a really quick view of, I have a large chart at my house that's much larger than this, but this gives you a very, very abbreviated view of the evolution of the Hebrew script style. So Hebrew starts from right to left. It's written this way, right to left. It has always been written this way. Many of your ancient languages were written right to left, not left to right. But here you see the Aleph. This is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. This is the Beit, which is a house, much different from our houses today. Gimel, right here. So we'll just look at those three letters. So right here, we have an ox. This Aleph is an ox head. That ox head is there to tell you to make a certain sound. This is what we were talking about earlier. The ox head is to make you make a certain sound. Today, the Aleph in Hebrew is really kind of silent. It doesn't really make a sound. But anciently, it was a guttural. It would be something, gutturals are in the back of your throat. It's like when you flap your tongue in the front, you say like, drrr, drrr. You're doing that back here at the very back of your tongue. It's a very guttural. Those are gutturals. Hebrew has 3 gutturals, but I don't want to get complicated with it. But back then, the Aleph had a sound, and that ox head was to call your mind to make that sound. So right below that, you have kind of, oh, I didn't know touching that would make it, my cursor back over there. Right below that, you have kind of what we're talking about with, here we go again, with Paleo Hebrew right here. And this is just an abbreviated form, just like we saw with cuneiform, going from the pictures to the stamped with the stylus and the wedges. We have the same thing happening in Hebrew over here. It's just an oversimplification of these top letters here. It's how can we write these letters quicker? How can we get our message out faster? Here's a, you see this right here. Instead of drawing a human's head, I can quickly make almost like a P, and then that becomes an R all the way down. It's just how can we make it simpler? Now you get to the Middle Ages, they want to make it fancy, so they add all this extra work. That's what I meant. It's an oversimplification of language to a certain point, and then things started getting complicated again. But this kind of gives you a brief overview. It's not a Hebrew class, but it shows you the progression of the Hebrew script. Again, whether I'm using this top line of letters right here, or I'm using this bottom modern cursive Hebrew right here, the only thing that matters is the message that it's portraying. Is it telling the same message? The script doesn't matter. But this tells you, historically, this just shows you how the script has changed. This is one I threw in. This is an ancient inscription. We kind of have it in Paleo. I mentioned that the Paleo Hebrew was kind of at the time of the kings of Israel. So this is the Tel Dan Stela. My mentor, Dr. Cloud, dug on the site that found the Tel Dan Stela. Now, up until this was found in 1992, I think, or 1994, liberal scholars had been attacking the Bible very bad. There was no historical evidence of King David, the greatest king. And they said there's no way the King David is a complete fabrication of history. There's no examples of his kingship that we can find anywhere. And then lo and behold, Hebrew Union found this inscription that talks about the house of David, but it's written in this Paleo Hebrew script from the time of David. Quick overview of Aramaic. Aramaic is not used very much at all in the Bible, so it always gets kind of passed over. I took Aramaic for a semester. It's only offered for a semester, but it's used a few times in the Bible, so we obviously went over every single inscription in the Bible, which is very few. But interestingly enough, when you go back to the Hebrew, when you get to right here, Dead Sea Scrolls, you start going to what's called the block script. This is really borrowed from Aramaic. Hebrew borrows and starts transforming their letters, although it's not a complete borrowing, right? Because you can see how it still resembles each other, but they get that script from Aramaic. So Aramaic was the language of the Arameans, or the people of Aram. This is depicted in Akkadian literature going back to the middle third millennium BC. It's a long time ago. We don't have Aramaic that far back, but we have a representation of the people of Aram being spoken of that far back. When we get to, I didn't mention this with, I didn't even do a whole section on Akkadian. I just mentioned it with the cuneiform. Akkadian at the time of when it came to Abraham, at the time of the early Egyptian dynasties, Middle Kingdom to early Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, Late Kingdom, Egypt, time of the Exodus. Akkadian is what's referred to as the lingua franca. It's the language of the day. Now, it's kind of funny. Egypt they were kind of far removed from Assyria. So they tried to communicate with Akkadian, but their Akkadian was not very good. But the rest of the world, when they're writing from king to king, or they're writing some documents to business documents between nations of different languages, they would use Akkadian. Just like today, English is pretty much the lingua franca of the entire world. You can travel just about anywhere in the world and you're going to find English. You're going to find English capabilities just about anywhere. But this was what Aramaic became the lingua franca, the known world language that crossed territorial and people group boundaries. About the time of the end of the not the end of the Exodus, but the end of the captivity, when Israel's taken to Babylon. So 6th century, you're talking about Aramaic is, well, no, excuse me, before that. So 7th and 8th century was the height of Aramaic. The oldest inscriptions we have go about to the 11th or 12th century BC. We have some inscriptions that far back, but the height of Aramaic was the 7th century, which is, well, no, that's right. 7th century is right there along with the Babylonian captivity. It's going to be used all the way into the 1st century. Akkadian is used all the way into the 1st century, but Aramaic takes over as the lingua franca. 2 Kings 18:26 says that the wise man is able to speak both Hebrew and Aramaic. And we have 5 Old Testament passages here: Genesis, Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezra. Most notably, everyone always goes to Daniel, the inscriptions of Daniel from chapter 2, verse 4 to 7, verse 28. That's all in Aramaic. The New Testament has a few Aramaic words, but those words are just together. We don't have long passages or even any passages. It's usually like if they're trying to say something in Aramaic or something like that. Aramaic is not to be cast aside too much. We have this idea, this concept from some ancient Jewish texts that says, let not the Aramaic be lightly esteemed, because God chose to place it into his word. So again, we have a conservative view of the Bible, and therefore if we have a conservative view of the Bible, we understand that God has preserved his word in the manner that he wanted us to understand it. And he placed Aramaic passages, or he allowed, or he inspired. We talked about inspiration last week. He inspired Aramaic passages. What is that? How did I draw? I drew on my thing. Technology. All right. Moving forward. We talked about that. So moving forward to Greek. We've got a few minutes here, but I'm going to try to wrap this up. Just one slide on Greek, and we can talk about it some more if we need to. Was the New Testament written in Greek? And that's a debate that's been roaring. It's not really been a question up until the last 100 years. People get all these ideas of trying to say, they know this or know that. Again, language is intended to relay a message. If God chose Hebrew, or he chose Greek, or he chose Akkadian, or he chose Ugaritic, what difference does it make if the message is the same? The Bible makes no claim to Hebrew being the divine language or Aramaic being the divine language. Um, but the New Testament um, was written in Greek. So people say, um, there's no way they would have written in Greek. And I would just say, simply put, you'd have to show me the manuscripts of anything other than Greek. We can have a discussion on that as long as it's in good taste. But there's one problem for any claims to the New Testament being written in anything other than Greek. It's the fact that there are zero, not one single manuscript of Hebrew or Aramaic New Testament manuscripts. And when I say manuscript, we're talking about manuscripts, not translations. So we have Aramaic translations, really Syriac translations that are early. We have 4th or 5th century Syriac translations, which would not have even been the language that was used in Israel, but it was as a far north dialect. And then we have like Hebrew translations from the 11th century, 11th century CE or AD. There's zero manuscripts. We don't have any, but we have thousands of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Alexander the Great really brought the world into the Greek world. When he made his conquest, he brought Greek everywhere. And one thing that people don't understand, the Galilee, the place, the region that Jesus himself came from was known as the Galilee of the Greeks. It was known as the Galilee of the Greeks. We have synagogues that we've found in Israel that the entire synagogue's language, whether it's the inscriptions on walls, stones, and even Torah scrolls were found that were completely in Greek. So Greek is definitely being used. That's not to say we've already established that Aramaic was the lingua franca. But we also have to understand something else. When we're talking about the New Testament and what it was written in, we have to differentiate between languages that may have been spoken versus the text that was written. Did Jesus speak Aramaic? Probably so. Did he speak Greek? Probably so. Did he speak Hebrew? Probably so. I would say definitely Paul, who was a very educated man, spoke all three without a doubt. But what was the language that was written in? That's the question. So Phoenician is understood to be the source of Greek. So I think I have another slideshow that I gave for another class where I show the breakdown of languages. It's kind of a chart, and you'll see Phoenician and Greek and Hebrew both come off of that. But what's important about that is understanding that Greek is somewhat Semitic in nature. Even though we understand it to be a far Western language compared to the other languages, is still Semitic in nature, not Semitic language, but Semitic in nature. It was read right to left initially, just like Hebrew. And then we have this time in history, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, I always mess it up, where it was written in a method called boustrophodon. Boustrophodon. Now, this is a Greek word that basically means as the ox plows. As the ox plows. So the Greek would be, let me get my cursor over here. The Greek it was initially written, understood right to left, just like that. And then you come to the next line, right to left. Boustrophodon, as the ox plows, would go right to left. The next line would be left to right. Next line will be right to left. Next line will be left to right. It goes back and forth. It snakes down. And then eventually we get to where Greek is today, and it's written left to right. One of the most impactful works, it's 9:01, so I need to wrap up. One of the most impactful works that we have in Greek, the most important works for us in biblical studies, something that will no doubt find its way into my dissertation, whatever it may be on, no matter the subject or the topic, the Septuagint will definitely play a role. Is the Septuagint. It is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, written from about 250 to 100 BCE. Originally, it was just the first 5 books, the Torah of Moses, and eventually it's being written, the whole Testament plus a few other books, minus a few books. But generally speaking, the Old Testament, it is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. The LXX, that is 70 I mean, 70, it goes along with this tradition that 70 Jewish elders sat down and translated the Old Testament into Greek. This is important for two things. One, it goes back to the topic of what was the New Testament written in? Was it written in Greek? Well, 300 years before the writing of the New Testament, they already found that it was vital to the community of God's people to translate the Torah into Greek. Why? Because so many people had lost their understanding of Hebrew through captivity and stuff like that, and Greek was spreading across the land. It was already 250, 300 years prior to the New Testament. They were already translating the works of the Bible and using it, using the Greek, because people, that's what they understood. Did the New Testament writers use the Septuagint? This is where a lot of scholarly material has come out over the past couple decades to understand that 80% of the Old Testament references in the New Testament are quoting the Septuagint. How do we know that? Septuagint Greek is very different than the Greek of that time. I think last week when we started, I think I mentioned, I don't know, it may have been a class I gave for a school, I can't remember. The Greeks of the ancient world were actually fascinated with our Greek literature, the Septuagint, and then the New Testament works later. They were very fascinated with what our ancestors wrote in Greek. But while they were fascinated, and they were fascinated at the stories, they were also perplexed at the what they understood to be elementary use of Greek. It wasn't very good Greek. Here's what F.F. Bruce, a great scholar, had to say. He said, to one accustomed to reading good Greek, Septuagint Greek reads very oddly. But to a Greek reader acquainted with Hebrew idiom, Septuagint Greek is immediately intelligible. The words are Greek, but the construction is Hebrew. So when we have these quotations in the Greek New Testament, something that's written differently than the Septuagint, we have these quotations, whether it's Paul or Jesus is referring, or at least the recording of Jesus referring to Old Testament passages, we can determine that they are quoting the Septuagint versus the Hebrew Bible that we know at that time. So 80% of those are being done. And again, we have to understand there's nothing wrong with that. What is the message that's being portrayed? Is the message of God's word being carried forward? Is the story being told from generation to generation, regardless of the language? It becomes very important. That concept will become very important later on when we talk about different translations. So I want to give you one last slide. This is a picture here of the difference of Greek. So the top would be a depiction. I think that's a modern printing or modern rendition. But the top is what's referred to as an uncial, U-N-C-I-A-L, uncial Greek. So ancient Greek was uncial. It was all capital letters with no spaces or anything. You can see, again, we're trying to get any language we're in, we're trying to be more efficient and have it easier to write and transcribe. So we can understand how having all capital letters with no spaces between words or sentences would be very difficult to read for us today. But then below we have what's called minuscules. This is where you basically have capitals and lowercase letters with spaces, no punctuation like we have in Hebrew, but you become more efficient with your writing and reading and understanding of Greek as you move forward in history. So with that, we'll take a few minutes. I'm a few minutes late. I apologize. I don't like to do that, but I didn't want to get behind and say we needed to catch up on something next week. So if we have any questions, you can unmute if you want to and ask them out loud, or you can type them like we did last week. Are there slides that we should be seeing? Did anybody see the slides?
Yeah, they were up there. They weren't for part of the time.
Okay, all right. Sounds good.
Are we supposed to read anything this week, Matt?
Yes, ma'am. I will post just like I did last week. It'll probably be tomorrow. I will post the reading with some other material as well.
Okay.
And I'll probably post the slides since I didn't have the first half recorded like I did last week for those that didn't get to watch. I was surprised as many people watched it as they did last week. So
Great.
I will probably post the slides too. I think somebody asked for the slides last week, so I can definitely post both of those. Anybody else have any questions?
Matt,
Yes, ma'am.
you in the reading, you referred to several books that we should be using in the class. Where do we get those?
Oh, okay. So I just gave like some references to
Mhm.
some books that you may want to purchase. It's not a requirement for the class. I always like to give resources so that people can go and do further study. But I can put your syllabus has 4 or 5 of those books, and then I can post some links or something like that to some of the other books as well, and that way you can have those. Um, I like to share resources so people can continue their study. I don't have all the answers, nor should anybody be looking to me in that manner. So I should be building everyone up to be able to study better. So that was kind of that. But I can definitely get you some a list of names of some other books.
All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks for coming. Anybody else? I think I see 2 more. Oh, let's see. Theme of the day: the script isn't as important as the message it's meant to convey. I probably said it too much, but that I just think that we get lost in the intent of language when we get bogged down in trying to figure out the perfect script or the perfect pronunciation. When the whole point of language in general, no matter what language it is to tell a story, to relay a message. So, all right. Well, thank you, scholars. I appreciate you joining me tonight, bearing with me, and as I'm on the road trying to do this class, and look forward to seeing you next week. Definitely encourage more contribution to the questions or the discussion questions. We can all learn from each other. We can all learn. I will learn some stuff from all of you guys. So that's why that's there, so that we can learn from each other. Your opinions, your thoughts are both welcomed and honored.
Matt, then are you intending for that to be kind of a interactive discussion board?
That's right. Yeah. So everybody can post their thoughts and interact with each other. If you see, and I should have interacted more with the few that were already on there this week. If you see some people posting, like, interact with, yes, absolutely. We're supposed to be carrying this discussion forward through the week and building
Okay.
on this class. That's absolutely the intent. All right. Thank you. Have a great night, and
Thank you,
blessings
Matt.
and shalom.
Shalom.
Shalom.